2 a.m., in the heart of Caracas, the sitting president of Venezuela was pulled from his bedroom by foreign soldiers, and the world woke up to a government without its leader. So how did the most protected man in South America disappear in under 3 hours, without a war being declared? How did the United States know exactly where to strike? Inside a country that swore it was untouchable, who betrayed him from the inside? Why was oil mentioned more than democracy afterward? And what weapon did witnesses say never made a sound? Because what happened that night didn't start in January. It started years earlier. Nicolás Maduro was not born into power. He was a bus driver in Caracas, steering through the crowded streets of a Venezuela that still had hope. He joined Hugo Chávez's socialist revolution, rose through the ranks, became foreign minister, and when Chávez died in 2013, Maduro inherited a nation and a legacy he could never fill. From the beginning, accusations followed him: election fraud, brutal repression, human rights violations, and perhaps most damning, narco-terrorism. The United States accused him of turning Venezuela into a narco-state, partnering with drug cartels like the Cartel of the Suns and criminal gangs like Tren de Aragua. In 2020, American prosecutors indicted him on charges of cocaine importation conspiracy and weapons trafficking. They put a $15 million bounty on his head. But indictments don't topple governments. Under Maduro's rule, Venezuela collapsed. Oil production, once the lifeblood of the nation, plummeted from 3.2 million barrels per day in 2000 to barely 1 million by 2025. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency. The bolivar became worthless. Food disappeared from shelves. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled their homeland, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. In 2017, massive protests erupted. The government cracked down. 125 people were killed. Thousands were arrested. The world watched, condemned, and did nothing. Then came the 2024 presidential election on July 28th. The opposition candidate, Edmundo González, won decisively. Verifiable tally sheets covering 80% of polling stations showed he secured 67% of the vote. But Maduro's regime announced a different result: 51.2% for the incumbent. Fabricated, fraudulent, obvious. Protests ignited again. 25 people were killed. Hundreds were injured. By September, nearly 1,800 political prisoners filled Venezuelan jails. Edmundo González fled to Spain. The world condemned again. And again, nothing changed. But this time, something was different. Behind closed doors, in rooms far from public view, a different kind of planning had begun. Because indictments don't remove presidents. Something else had to happen. The moment everything shifted wasn't visible to the public. It happened in secure facilities, in encrypted communications, in meetings where only a handful of people knew the full picture. The 2024 election was the breaking point. The evidence was overwhelming. The violence was undeniable. The political prisoners numbered in the thousands. And the United States, under Donald Trump's second term, decided that pressure was no longer enough. Sanctions had failed. Diplomatic isolation had failed. Supporting the opposition had failed. Maduro remained in power, protected by thousands of soldiers, by Russian-made weapons systems, by Cuban intelligence operatives embedded in his security apparatus. He believed he was untouchable. Somewhere in Washington, planners stopped talking about sanctions and started talking about timelines. Briefing documents began to circulate with a codename: Operation Absolute Resolve. This was no longer about applying pressure. It was about removal. In August 2025, the CIA began the most critical phase of intelligence gathering it had conducted in Latin America in decades. Agents worked to penetrate Maduro's inner circle. They needed more than satellite images or intercepted communications. They needed someone on the inside. Someone close enough to know routines, schedules, movements. Someone who could tell them where Maduro slept, when he ate, how many guards stood outside his door at 3 in the morning. And they found that person. The exact identity remains classified, but the intelligence that flowed out was precise, detailed, and recent. Maduro's breakfast time, 7 a.m. Cabinet meetings, 9 a.m. Bedtime, 11 p.m. Even the pet names he used. Every habit, every routine, every vulnerability. Because removing a president doesn't just require force. It requires knowing his every move, even in his sleep. The mole was extraordinary, not just in access, but in nerve. Whoever they were, they operated for months under the eyes of some of the most paranoid security forces in the world. Cuban intelligence officers surrounded Maduro. His personal guard numbered in the thousands. Russian advisors trained his troops. Chinese equipment monitored his communications. And yet, somewhere in that fortress, someone was talking. The intelligence they provided wasn't just schedules, it was psychological. Maduro had nearly accepted an exile offer during a direct phone call with Donald Trump 1 week before the raid. He was on the verge of saying yes, of taking refuge in Turkey or another third country. But his generals talked him out of it. They convinced him that Fort Tiuna, his military compound in Caracas, was impregnable, that he was safe. That belief would be his downfall. The CIA also conducted secret negotiations with regime hardliners, Diosdado Cabello, members of Delcy Rodriguez's circle. They floated ideas of a post-Maduro transition, of guarantees, of safe passage. The offers were rejected, but the conversations served another purpose. They mapped the fault lines within the regime. They identified who might stand aside when the moment came. Someone was talking, and they were very close. Fort Tiuna was supposed to be unbreachable. 3,000 soldiers garrisoned the complex. Russian-made Buk M2E surface-to-air missile systems ringed the perimeter. Advanced radar installations scanned the skies. Chinese surveillance equipment monitored approaches. And deep within the compound, Maduro had constructed a steel-reinforced safe room, 50 feet from his bedroom, accessible through a concealed corridor, designed to withstand anything short of a direct artillery strike. He had been warned. US forces had struck alleged drug vessels in September 2025. A naval blockade intercepted tankers in December. A drone strike on a port facility in late December served as a final, unmistakable message. The pressure was escalating. But Maduro didn't run. He believed in his fortress. He believed in his Russian weapons. He believed in the soldiers who surrounded him. Fortresses, however, have a fatal flaw. They only work when everyone inside wants to keep the enemy out. And as the final days of 2025 turned into early January 2026, something strange was happening inside Fort Tiuna. Key defensive units weren't being rotated. Certain communication channels went quiet. Routine patrols shifted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Years later, Maduro's son would release an audio message alluding to traitors. The Venezuelan military would never explain why the raid faced so little organized resistance. And the United States would never confirm the extent of the internal cooperation. But the speed of what happened next tells its own story. Weather delayed the operation. Original plans were pushed back. Conditions had to be perfect, not just meteorologically, but politically and operationally. Trinidad and Tobago quietly granted the United States access to staging bases. Over 150 aircraft were positioned across 20 bases throughout the Western Hemisphere. F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning IIs, B-52 Stratofortress bombers, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare jets, MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Night Stalkers, RQ-170 Sentinel stealth drones, and for the first time in combat, one-way attack drones, expendable and precise. Delta Force operators trained on a full-scale replica of Maduro's compound for 2 months. Every door, every hallway, every turn rehearsed until muscle memory replaced thought. FBI hostage rescue team agents prepared legal arrest protocols because this wasn't officially a military operation. It was, according to US framing, a law enforcement action. US Cyber Command stood ready to disable Venezuela's power grid, communications networks, and backup systems. Every element synchronized to a single moment. January 3rd, 2026. 2 a.m. Caracas time. 10 seconds before the strike, Venezuela's power grid began to fail. Then, everything went dark. The blackout wasn't partial, it was total. Caracas went dark. Military installations lost power. Communication towers fell silent. Backup generators failed to engage. Jammed by invisible signals. Neutered by code injected weeks earlier. And then the sky opened. 7 simultaneous explosions. La Carlota Air Base, Puerto La Cruz Port, Higuerote Airport, military communication towers, and the defensive perimeter around Fort Tiuna itself. Precision munitions struck with the kind of accuracy that only comes from perfect intelligence and overwhelming technological superiority. Russian-made air defenses didn't fire a single shot. Chinese radars didn't track the incoming aircraft. The fortress that Maduro believed was untouchable didn't even know it was under attack until the explosions started. Witnesses on the ground reported something strange. Venezuelan guards at Fort Tiuna described feeling disoriented before the helicopters arrived. Nosebleeds, ear pain, a sensation like pressure building inside their skulls. Some collapsed. Others stumbled, unable to coordinate movement. Later, Donald Trump would hint at weapons that nobody knows about in a News Nation interview. The Pentagon never confirmed, but the effects matched descriptions of non-lethal directed energy systems or advanced sonic weapons, technology that exists but is rarely acknowledged. At first, there was no gunfire, just silence, confusion, and then the unmistakable sound of rotor blades cutting through the night. The helicopters were already overhead. 12 Delta Force operators fast roped onto the roof of Maduro's residence. Their movements were rehearsed, precise, mechanical, no hesitation, no confusion. They knew the layout better than some of the people who lived there. Controlled detonations breached the outer doors. Blowtorches cut through reinforced steel. The operators moved through hallways they had walked 100 times in training, toward a bedroom they had memorized down to the furniture placement. Inside, Nicolas Maduro woke to the sound of explosions. He was in pajamas, disoriented. The safe room was 50 feet away. He started toward it. He never made it. The door to his bedroom blew inward. Operators poured through. Maduro's security detail fired AK-47s and machine guns in desperation, but they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outnumbered by soldiers who had trained for this exact scenario for 2 months. US M134 miniguns suppressed return fire. One Black Hawk took damage, but continued flying. Cilia Flores, Maduro's wife, was detained in the chaos. Reports suggest she was struck in the head during the breach, injured, but alive. And Nicolas Maduro, the sitting president of Venezuela, the man who had ruled for over a decade, who had survived protests and sanctions and assassination attempts, was zip-tied on the floor of his own bedroom. By the time Venezuelan military units outside the compound realized what was happening, it was already over. The operators and their prisoners were moving toward the extraction point. The helicopters were lifting off. Gunfire erupted too late. A few desperate shots into the night, but the aircraft were already out of range, climbing into the darkness, heading for the coast. By 5:21 a.m., Nicolas Maduro was aboard the USS Iwo Jima. By that afternoon, he was in New York. The most powerful man in Venezuela was no longer in Venezuela. At 5:21 a.m., Caracas time, Donald Trump posted a photo on Truth Social. Maduro, disheveled and detained, surrounded by US personnel. The caption was brief. The message was clear. The world woke up to the impossible. A sitting head of state had been captured by a foreign military and removed from his own country. It wasn't a coup. It wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. It was something unprecedented in modern international relations. Allies of the United States were stunned. Many hadn't been informed in advance. Enemies were furious. China condemned it as aggression. Russia called it a violation of sovereignty. Iran, Cuba, Brazil, Mexico, Nicaragua, all issued statements of outrage. The United Nations convened emergency sessions. International law experts called it a crime of aggression under the UN Charter, a violation of Article 2.4, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. There was no claim of self-defense, no UN Security Council authorization, no declaration of war. But there also was no mechanism to reverse what had happened. Latin American nations expressed alarm at the precedent. If the United States could do this to Venezuela, what stopped them from doing it elsewhere? Colombia called for a Security Council meeting. Protests erupted in capitals across the region, but not everyone condemned it. Argentina, Germany, Israel, Peru, and Ukraine focused their statements on Maduro's record, on the election fraud, the human rights abuses, the narco-terrorism. France's Emmanuel Macron criticized the method, but acknowledged the legitimacy of the charges. The reaction was polarized, chaotic, and ultimately inconsequential. Because Maduro was already in custody, facing a federal judge in New York. The United States reported minimal casualties, 7 troops injured, 5 from shrapnel and gunfire, all of whom recovered. No American fatalities. Venezuela told a different story. Over 100 dead, according to government sources. 23 to 47 soldiers killed, including 9 women. 112 injured. 2 to 3 civilians, a Colombian national in El Hatillo, another in Catia La Mar. Cuba confirmed 32 military and intelligence personnel killed. 2 colonels, a lieutenant colonel, officers who formed what Havana described as Maduro's innermost ring. Their bodies were repatriated on January 15th. Cuba declared a week of mourning. Independent estimates suggested 77 to 83 total deaths, but the truth was obscured by information warfare. Both sides had incentives to lie. The US to minimize the perception of violence, Venezuela and Cuba to paint the operation as a massacre. What is certain is that civilians died. Strikes hit urban areas, a math center, a warehouse. The precision that defined the raid's success did not extend to every target, and the discrepancies in the numbers ensured that the true human cost would never be fully known. On January 5th, Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as acting president of Venezuela. She had been Maduro's vice president, a regime insider, complicit in the system that had brought the country to ruin. But she was also pragmatic. Within days, political prisoners began to be released. The government claimed 400. NGOs verified 139. The releases were selective, foreigners first, then opposition figures whose continued detention would be diplomatically costly. But over 800 political prisoners remained in Venezuelan jails. Military patrols increased in Caracas. A state of emergency was declared. Pro-Maduro supporters clashed with security forces in scattered protests, but the demonstrations lacked coordination. The opposition, meanwhile, celebrated cautiously. Many had suffered too much to believe the nightmare was truly over. Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader who had won the Nobel Peace Prize for her courage, called for free elections. Edmundo González, still in exile in Spain, was recognized by the United States as the legitimate winner of the 2024 election. But neither was invited to negotiate Venezuela's future. The system remained. The generals remained. The corruption remained. The president was gone, but the structure of power was intact. Within 72 hours of Maduro's capture, the United States announced temporary oversight of Venezuela's oil sector. The justification was rebuilding infrastructure, ensuring stability, negotiating energy deals with international partners. The reality was less diplomatic. Donald Trump had made statements about oil before the raid. He called Venezuelan resources stolen. He said the United States would run Venezuela to recover what was owed. By January 21st, $500 million in Venezuelan oil sales had been transferred to US-controlled accounts. Tankers moved. Deals were discussed. Firms like Chevron and ExxonMobil began cautious re-engagement. Critics called it resource imperialism. Supporters called it restitution, but the timing was undeniable. Oil figured more prominently in post-raid statements than democracy, elections, or human rights. Venezuela has 30 to 50 billion barrels of oil reserves. Reviving production would require over $100 billion in investment. The country's infrastructure was in ruins. PDVSA, the state oil company, was a shell of its former self. And yet, the United States was already positioning itself to benefit. The opposition, sidelined in the negotiations, watched as foreign powers divided the spoils of a country they claimed to be liberating. The president was gone, but the system remained. So what was Operation Absolute Resolve? Was it justice? The removal of a dictator accused of narco-terrorism, election fraud, and crimes against humanity? Or was it precedent, a demonstration that the United States can and will remove foreign leaders unilaterally, without international approval, without declarations of war, whenever it deems necessary? Was it law enforcement, as the US government claimed? Or was it an undeclared act of war, a violation of sovereignty so brazen that it redefined the boundaries of acceptable international conduct? Was it liberation? Or was it resource control, a calculated operation to secure oil reserves under the guise of fighting drugs and defending democracy? The answers depend on who you ask. For the 7 million Venezuelans who fled their country, for the families of the 125 killed in the 2017 protests, for the 1,800 political prisoners arrested after the 2024 election, Maduro's removal might feel like justice, long overdue. But for international law scholars, for diplomats who spent decades building frameworks to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral action, for leaders of smaller nations who now wonder if they could be next, Operation Absolute Resolve is a nightmare precedent. It bypassed Congress. The War Powers Resolution was sidestepped by framing the operation as law enforcement. No authorization for use of military force was sought. The president acted alone, testing the outer limits of executive authority. It bypassed the United Nations. No Security Council resolution, no multilateral coalition, just a decision made in Washington and executed in Caracas. And it worked. That's the most unsettling part. It worked. Maduro is in custody. The operation achieved its tactical objectives with minimal US casualties. The fortress fell, the defenses failed. The most protected man in South America was captured in under 3 hours. But what comes next? Delcy Rodriguez's government cooperates on oil, but clings to power. The opposition is sidelined. The military remains intact. The corruption remains entrenched. Venezuela is not suddenly free. It's under new management, with old problems and uncertain futures. And beyond Venezuela, the ripple effects are spreading. Cuba faces threats of similar action. Colombia signed anti-guerrilla cooperation pacts. Mexico nervously watches the rhetoric. Greenland hears annexation threats. The Monroe Doctrine has been reborn as what some call the Donroe Doctrine, a reassertion of US dominance in the Western Hemisphere, backed not by diplomacy, but by the demonstrated willingness to act unilaterally and decisively. Think tanks warn of contradictory visions. Is Venezuela a protectorate, a partner, a resource pool? Without opposition involvement, without a clear transition plan, without addressing the root causes of the collapse, the operation risks repeating the failures of Iraq. Tactical success, strategic ambiguity, long-term chaos. Oil prices rose 1% after the raid. Venezuelan bonds surged 30%. Markets reacted with optimism. But global oil markets are oversupplied. Reviving Venezuelan production won't transform the industry. It will take years, billions of dollars, and political stability that doesn't exist. Maduro pleaded not guilty at his arraignment on January 5th. He faces trial in March. Cilia Flores faces similar charges. Both are held without bail. Their legal fate is almost certain: conviction, long sentences, perhaps life in prison. But their political fate is more complex. They are symbols now, martyrs to some, criminals to others. Their removal didn't end the Venezuelan crisis, it transformed it. This wasn't just a raid on a man, It was a message to every leader who believed power made them untouchable. It was a message to allies who thought sovereignty was absolute. It was a message to enemies who assumed the United States wouldn't act without international consensus. The message was simple. Assumptions can be wrong, fortresses can fall, defenses can fail, presidents can vanish. Because in the modern world, where intelligence can penetrate inner circles, where cyber weapons can disable power grids in seconds, where special operations forces can rehearse raids on full-scale replicas until execution is mechanical, geography doesn't protect you, soldiers don't protect you, walls don't protect you. The only thing that might protect you is the willingness of the other side to abide by rules, norms, and laws that took centuries to build. And on January 3rd, 2026, at 2:00 a.m. in Caracas, those rules were tested. Some would say they held that Maduro was a criminal, that his capture was justice, that international law allows for accountability even when it's messy. Others would say the rules shattered, that sovereignty died, that precedent was set, that the world became less stable because one nation decided the ends justified the means. History will judge, courts will rule, scholars will debate. But one thing is undeniable. Even presidents can vanish overnight.